Okay, folks, hope everybody's doing well. This is a set of lectures on virtue ethics in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. In particular, we're going to look at Stoicism and Epicurean versions of virtue ethics. In ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, the approaches to ethics tended to be were virtue-based approaches, as opposed to the modern moral theories that we've looked at as well, or will look at, depending on what order the lectures are going in your class. In modern moral theories like deontology and consequentialism or utilitarianism, those, you can think of those approaches to moral theory as emphasizing actions. What they're attempting to do, what those theories are attempts to do, is to identify and defend some prescriptive or normative standard that helps us distinguish between actions that are permissible, impermissible, and so forth, right? And so the target of moral evaluations for those theories is the action. Well, the target of moral evaluation in a virtue ethics is not the action being performed or the consequences of the action, but the character traits of the agent performing the action. And so virtue-based approaches emphasize character, they're character-based approaches to moral theory or philosophical ethics rather than action-based. And that's a bit of an oversimplification of the dichotomy, but there's certainly or the difference between those two types of theorizing with regard to morality, but they get across the basic idea that there seems to be a difference in the target of moral evaluation with respect to these different theories. There's a further debate that we could look at about whether a virtue ethics or an action-based theories on its own are complete theories, or whether you need to account for both character traits and virtues. So there's one debate in moral theory there, philosophical ethics there. For our purposes, we're just going to look at a couple of different approaches to virtue ethics. The big thinker that's almost always associated with virtue ethics, at least in contemporary moral philosophy, is Aristotle. And so Aristotle had this idea of the golden mean, and the golden mean was the idea that virtue consisted of a mean between excess and deficiency, too little and too much of a trait. So courage, for example, one of the cardinal virtues, although Aristotle had a much longer list of virtues than just the 4 cardinal virtues, courage is a mean between running foolhardily into battle without a plan and running away when the first shot is fired, right? So courage is a mean between those two things. The two versions of virtue ethics that we'll look at in these two lectures, Stoicism and Epicurean ethics, are slightly different than Aristotle's version, but they could both be said to fit under this umbrella of natural law approaches to ethics, because living ethically is going to mean living in accordance to some aspect of nature, according to each of these theories. It's just that they disagree about what human nature is, or what nature is, or what parts of nature we should live in accordance with. Right, but they all fall under the rubric of virtue-based approaches. You can think of a roughly, again, kind of a generalization. You can think of virtue ethics as positing the idea of a moral hero or heroine, the ideal moral character, and then what kinds of character traits does that ideal have to have in order to be that sort of ideal, and then how can we go about cultivating those character traits. And so these theories are focused on happiness, but they have different views of happiness, and then the character traits that enable us to be happy, right? So that's a basic idea of what a virtue ethics is up to. So I've mentioned happiness, and in Rick and Morty, lots and lots of the characters are unhappy in various respects. Summer's unhappy and tries to pursue happiness largely through, trying to become a popular girl in high school. Morty is often unhappy and tries to pursue romantic love with Jessica in order to be happy. Beth needs to find out how to be a complete woman. Jerry is very unhappy, kind of a milquetoast guy. And Rick, of course, is generally unhappy as well. And so we can ask, Well, according to Stoicism or according to Epicureanism or to Aristotle's version of virtue ethics, what could they do in order to lead happier lives, more ethical lives? And so again, happiness is connected to ethics here in a way that you don't see in many other approaches to moral philosophy. All right, so first let's take a look at the Stoics here. So some key ideas in Stoicism in general and Stoic ethics in particular. First, this is a eudaimonistic conception of ethics, like most approaches to ethics in ancient philosophy, meaning that they posit some notion of human flourishing or happiness. I mentioned happiness. A better word for eudaimonistic is probably human flourishing or well-being, right? We tend to think of happiness in terms of an elated feeling that we get that's transitory, but that's not really how the ancient thinkers thought of happiness, of genuine happiness anyway. And so what eudaimonia, human flourishing, for the Stoics is an idea of inner peace or tranquility, right? A key idea here is the notion of indifference. We'll have to think about what indifference means for the Stoics. There's a potential misunderstanding right there. Then the notion of apathy, again, or apatheia, right, which is, you might recognize that as being close to our word apathy. And again, there's a potential misunderstanding there for the Stoics. It doesn't mean freedom from all feelings. It means freedom from negative feelings. And then I'll talk about a couple of different Stoic techniques or practices. They're supposed to be able to help us develop or help individuals develop tranquility. And so there is a big difference between the Stoics and other ancient philosophers like Plato. For the Stoics, they had a naturalistic approach to ethics. Ethics was a matter of living in accordance with nature, the natural world, and the rational structure of that world, as opposed to conforming to abstract ideals like in Plato. Right? So that's a difference to keep in mind. Both. Again, Plato was a virtue ethicist as well, and talks about how to have inner balance among the different parts of the soul, with reason governing both courage and our desires. And there's a little bit of that element too with the Stoics. It's just that they think of the natural world or nature, genuine nature, in terms of the rational structure of the physical universe. The natural world as opposed to some natural extra abstract reality or metaphysical reality, something like that. And so here are the basic principles then of Stoic ethics. First is that virtue is the highest good. Everything else is an indifferent. And again, we'll need to talk about what indifference means here. Again, there's a potential for a misunderstanding there when we hear that word. And then to live in accordance with the rational structure of nature, and this idea of the dichotomy of control, which is connected to the rational structure of nature for the Stoics. And again, when I talk about virtues here for the Stoics, I just had, as well as in Plato, Aristotle's a little bit different here because he has a much longer list of virtues. I'm just really referring to, with regard to the Stoics, the cardinal virtues. So wisdom or prudence, right? Discerning the right course of action, application of principles to general principles to concrete cases or particular cases in order to achieve a particular result. The virtue of courage is central here among the cardinal virtues. Justice, treat everyone else regardless of their station in terms of fairness and kindness. And then temperance, exercising moderation. So again, we can think of how to reach tranquility as the Stoics understand it, inner peace. We have to have these virtues. We have to cultivate these virtues. Well, how do we go about doing that sort of thing? And so first, again, this idea of just following nature. And again, what I've done here is fill out, is provide y'all with some kind of what I think of as key quotations to get across some of these basic ideas. So Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic thinker, and he says, think of the life you have lived until now as over, and as a dead man, see what's left. As a bonus, and live it according to nature. Notice nature with a capital N there. Right? Love the hand that fate deals you and play it as your own hand for what could be more fitting. So there's this idea of nature and fate there. So things that are beyond our control, at least aspects of nature are beyond our control. And so this is where what what's called the dichotomy of control comes in. I'm going to think of it in terms of a trichotomy instead of a dichotomy, however. So I've got I'm using the common slogan here, dichotomy of control, but I think we need to divide it, following some other scholars. We should divide it up in 3 categories instead of just 2, so a trichotomy. So originally Epictetus said, on the one hand, there are some things that are in our power, whereas other things are not in our power. So there's the dichotomy, right? Things that are in our control and things that are not in our control. But then he further divides this. He says, in our power are opinion, impulse, desire, aversions, and in a word, whatever is our own doing. Things not in our power include our body, our possessions, our reputations, or our status, and in a word, whatever is not our doing. So a part of the rational structure of the world is that some things are within our control and other things are not within our control. But again, I'm going to divide that into 3 elements here. So first of all, things over which we have complete or total control, and then things which we have no control over whatsoever, and then things that are partly under our control but partly not under our control. So there's the 3rd category here. And then here's some examples to go along with each. So things that I have complete control over are what sorts of values that I pick, right? And the notion of indifference, right, is that some things are not in our control and that we should not care. Here's the indifference part. We should not care about things that are not within our control. That's the Stoic notion of indifference. They don't mean being not caring or apathetic towards everything. What they're saying is we should concern ourselves with and care about things that are within our control. And so then things over which we have no control whatsoever, well, things like the seasons, the changing of the seasons, or whether there's a pandemic or not, right? That was a natural result, a result of natural processes, right? So according to these things are hurricanes, right? An even better example. We can't control whether a hurricane is coming this summer or not. And these are things about which I should not concern myself. And we'll flush this notion out a little bit further here with some more quotations. And then things over which we have some but not total control. Well, things like whether or not I can win a game or not, because how well the other team plays is not under my control, but certainly influences the outcome there. And so with regard to these things, I should concern myself with them, but I should take care to not internalize the goals of those things such that I only have respect for them. So like getting caught up on whether I'm just the win or the loss and not how I played the game, right? So I shouldn't internalize just the goal of a win or a loss, of winning only. I should take a broader approach to that sort of issue. That's the Stoic advice here. So again, concern yourself with these things, but take care to internalize the goals you form with respect to them. Well, if winning is all that matters, then I'm going to be really wound up every time I lose, but whether I win or lose is not totally within my control. It has to do with what other people do as well, or what the refs do, as Saints fans know. And so here's some Stoic techniques then. They give us some practices for trying to cultivate this apatheia, right? Or our Stoic indifference towards what we can't control. And here's some just different examples. If you were to get a book, you can find all sorts of books these days about how to live like a Stoic and these sorts of things, right? So I pulled a couple of these things out. The view from above, recalling impermanence, negative visualization, testing impressions. The thing with impressions, testing impressions, that was discussed a good bit in the article, in one of the articles that I may have assigned for you to read out of the Rick and Morty book. So if you're reading that article or that book as a part of the course, that really matches up with the impressions here, testing impressions here. Or testing impressions matches up well with that reading assignment rather. And then how we respond to insults and doing so with humor. So again, some basic Stoic techniques for trying to cultivate inner tranquility. So a quote from Marcus Aurelius about this practice of the view from above. Every time I think of this, the first thing that comes to my mind is this scene at the end of Men in Black, where we find out that we're this little bitty thing in a vast universe, right? Because it's just pulling out perspectives broader and broader and broader. So Aurelius says, watch and see the courses of the stars as if you were running alongside them, and continually dwell in your mind upon the changes of the elements into one another. When you are reasoning about mankind, look upon earthly things below as if from some vantage point above them. So it's taking a third person standpoint or visualization, right? From a third person standpoint outside of myself, right? So first, imagine yourself looking down at yourself from just over your own head. Move up to imagine looking down at yourself from the ceiling of the room you're in. Move up to imagine looking down at yourself from just above campus or just above your house, then above your city, then above your country or continent, hemisphere, globe, universe, right? Keep going out in ever expansive circles. And what do we find? That in the grand scheme of things, these small things do not matter. So about here's a quotation from a scholar of Stoicism, Pierre Haudet, as a French scholar. And he says, philosophy in antiquity was an exercise practiced in each instant. It invites us to concentrate on each instant of life to become aware of the infinite value of each present moment. Once we have replaced it with the perspective of the cosmos, the view from above, the exercise of wisdom entails a cosmic dimension, then, whereas the average person has lost touch with the world and does not see the world qua world, the rational structure of the world, but rather treats the world as a means to satisfying his own desires. The sage, the wise person, never ceases to have the whole constantly present to mind and thinks and acts within a cosmic perspective, and has the feeling of a whole which goes beyond the limits of individuality. So if I'm just focused on my perspective from the vantage point of my own head, I'm going to be very caught up with my own feelings, especially feelings about things that I cannot control. But if I take the cosmic perspective, then I realize that there are things outside of myself, and that nature is outside of myself, right? So here's, we just look at Marcus Aurelius. Here's Epictetus on impermanence, right? So you could compare and contrast this idea with, attachment in Buddhism, right? So in the case of particular things that delight you or benefit you, or to which you have grown attached, remind yourself of what they are. Start with the things of little value. If it is china you like, for instance, a piece of fine dishware, say, I'm fond piece of china. When it breaks, then you won't be disconcerted. When giving your wife or child a kiss, repeat to yourself, I am kissing a mortal. Then you won't be so distraught if they are taken away from you. So again, we might look at this and have a gut reaction that what he's saying is don't care or don't love your kids or your wife or something like that. But that's not really, that's kind of an overstatement and to the point of mischaracterization what the Stoics are up to here. It's that we should just be reminded that things are not lasting. Things do fade away. And so we shouldn't get so attached to them that we become incapacitated once they're gone. It's not quite the same thing as saying that we ought to not give a shit about our loved ones or friends and family. And then here's another Stoic technique, negative visualization. So what sorts of things could go wrong, right? We often don't anticipate things that could go wrong, and so our plans go awry. So connection to wisdom there, right? Or prudence. So Seneca says, who's another Stoic thinker, says, nothing happens to the wise man against his expectation, nor do all things turn out for him as he wished, but as he reckoned. And above all, he reckoned that something could block his plans. He gives this example of a rather mundane thing of like going to the bathhouse, right? Or to the bath. So we just look at Seneca here on the basic idea of negative visualization. Here's Epictetus on negative visualization. So just think of his example, how mundane it is. He says, when you're going to perform an act, remind yourself of what things that act may involve. all the little things that may be involved in completing that larger act or that larger goal. When going to the swimming pool, reflect on what may happen at the pool. Some will splash the water, some will push against one another, others will abuse one another, and others will steal. Thusly, you have mentally prepared yourself to undertake the act, and you can say to yourself, I now intend to bathe and am prepared to maintain my will in all virtuous manner, having warned myself of what may occur. In other words, prepare yourself for stuff to go wrong, right? So do this for every act so that if any hindrance does emerge, you can think, I did not prepare myself only to undertake the act, but also for the hindrance that has occurred, and also handle this hindrance virtuously and keep my will conformed to nature, and it will be impossible to become vexed. So if I'm anticipating things going wrong, then I'm not going to be deeply troubled, negative emotion, when things happen to go wrong. I'll be able to face those situations. So what's the worst that could happen? Here's some 4 basic steps to perform the negative visualization practice then. So identify some action or activity. It could be as mundane as trying to get through a philosophy class. I'm recording this for an intercession class. It's very quick paced, meets only about 12 days for longer periods of time. So it's very quick paced class then. What could go wrong in trying to take a intercession class that requires several hours of devotion to that topic every day? Well, especially in the pandemic times, what happens if someone gets sick? What happens if you get sick, right? Or someone that's in your household gets sick while you're trying to complete this class? Or you have an internet outage while you're trying to complete this class via remote learning. So 2, what sorts of things or other actions are involved in the main task? So think of all the subtasks and what could go wrong with each of those. What sorts of things can we expect to occur as a result of having to perform these subtasks? And then what sorts of things could go wrong while engaged in these activities? What's the worst that could happen? And think pragmatically about what the worst that could happen is, even if it's unlikely, and spend some time preparing oneself to address that issue. So then what is the result of reflecting on the worst that could happen? Did you develop a capacity for addressing the problems that arise? Did we imagine the worst that could happen? Did that lessen the impact of negative effects when they actually did occur? So you could think about, sometimes I ask students to do basically a journal exercise where they live according to one of the Stoic practices for a week, and then write up a journal entry, or even if it's just for one's own self, about what were the results of engaging in that practice. And then the last activity here for cultivating indifference and not worrying about what you can't control is the idea of responding to insults with humor, right? Sometimes we might respond to an insult very poorly. I've just been rewatching The Sopranos, and many of those guys, man, they do not respond to insults well. So Epictetus says, if you learn that someone is speaking ill of you, don't try to defend yourself against the rumors. Respond instead with a yes. And he doesn't even know the half of it, because he could have said much more. So when someone tries to insult me, basically I turn it around and say, oh, you don't even know the half of how bad I am, or how dumb am I, man? You don't even know the half of how dumb I am. When someone calls you stupid. So respond with self-deprecating humor rather than trying to result or disprove the rumor, right? So I don't seem to have very much control over what people think of me if they form their impressions of me based not on an understanding of who I am or familiarity with me, but just hearsay. That's something that's not beyond my control. That's beyond my control. And then testing one's impressions, another Stoic technique. And again, this one's discussed in what you might have had as a reading assignment here from a Rick and Morty book. If not, it was probably discussed in whatever I had you read, or discussed in another book that I sometimes use for my ethics class. But here's Epictetus on testing one's impressions. Again, another one that's very easy to apply. So make a practice at once of saying to every strong impression, every strong reaction that I have, an impression is all you are, not the source of the impression. Then test and assess it with your criteria, but primarily ask, Is this something that is or is not in my control? And if it is not, one of the things you can control, be ready with the reaction. It's none of my concern. Right? So do I get upset when I see other people doing stuff, but it doesn't really affect me? And what they're doing is not under my control. I should not concern myself with it. So again, a way of testing my reactions to things to determine whether or not the thing that caused the reaction is something that I should genuinely be concerned with, is something under my control. And so we can think about this in regard to Rick and Morty. Rick sometimes seems to have an idea of the rational structure of things and to not concern himself with them. I think of his idea of love, for example, his remarks about love in this context, where he seems to understand that what we call love is a chemical reaction, and so we shouldn't get so worked up about when that chemical reaction fades. In other ways, it's pretty clear that Rick is not happy. So maybe he needs to apply some Stoic techniques more thoroughly than just recognizing the rational structure of things. He certainly doesn't seem to have inner tranquility. And we can see through many episodes, and really the series as a whole, various members of the Smith family trying to pursue happiness and think about, well, what would the Stoics say they're doing correctly or doing incorrectly in order to achieve at least the Stoic idea of happiness as one approach there. All right, so that does it for the lesson on Stoic ethics. You can pause here, maybe take a break. And if you have any questions, as always, about either the stuff beyond the reading questions that I've already provided, the study questions that I've provided, if you have questions about Stoic ideas, please bring them up during the live Q&A or put them in the discussion forum. And so that does it for our little trip through an introduction to Stoic ethics. Go ahead and pause here and take yourself a break before going on to the next lecture.